But I think even if you weren't, in a deep place of loneliness or alienation or have very bad traumas tied to feasts historically in your family narrative or whatever, you can still live with a tremendous amount of pressure to make it like the culture describes. And then you end up with disappointment and exhaustion and like that stress you were describing. And I think Jesus calls us to a different kind of feasting.
Right.
It's a different kind of simplicity. It's a different kind of welcome. Honestly, you could have a feast with a cup of coffee and a store-bought muffin. It's how you come at it.
Right. Welcome to Down to Earth. I'm Jessica DeSabatino.
And I'm Joyce Reese.
And this is a show where we want to be real about God, the scriptures, and how we live our Christian faith out in real time, honoring God and shaping our culture and community around us.
We dialogue about the purpose of vocational artists, social justice, generational transformation, why we bother with church, and a whole lot more.
We're Joyce and Jess, and we're friends, pastors, and speakers. We thought perhaps we could work on this project together and have a little fun. Our goal is to talk about things we have passion for, connect with others about what matters to them, and together impact our world and honor God.
So, welcome again to another episode of Down to Earth podcast. I'm Joyce Reese.
I'm Jess DeSabatino.
We're glad you're here today. So we're going to talk today about feasting as part of what it means to flourish.
Maybe my favorite episode.
Yeah, well, and it's a nice one to kind of wrap up the season with because we're thinking through what it is to be fully human. So we talked about this in maybe at the beginning of this section of the season, but the idea that we're about more than just dealing with the brokenness and the curse.
Sin management.
Yeah, sin management. Like the idea that we were created for something before the idea of the fall, which if you're just jumping in somewhere in the middle of episodes, you might have missed at the very beginning when we talked about meta-narrative and framing the whole story. Tying into that, then when you get to what it means to follow Jesus in real time, we also believe that there's meant to be a flourishing.
Yeah.
And so we want to talk about feasting as something that's central to what it is to be human.
And something central to being God's people, that there actually is spirituality
tied to it.
Tied to eating.
Yeah, isn't that cool?
This is amazing. I am known by my mother-in-law as the daughter-in-law who likes to eat.
Which is a big
my
deal.
Title.
In an Italian, you married into an Italian family?
I married into an Italian family, and my mother-in-law says that I am like an honorary Italian member.
That's
I'm
awesome.
learning Italian right now. Someday I will speak
Italian on the podcast.
Yeah, I practiced with my mother-in-law last night, and she said I'm starting to sound like an Italian.
Very cool. Mm-hmm. So then you could do the intro in Italian. That would be really interesting.
Yeah. So the thing is, though, I don't think as Christians we have really thought about food and the way that we eat and our habits in that way as related to our spirituality.
Right.
The problem is when we divorce food and eating and something central to humanity away from our spirituality, we're bifurcating our faith. So we're saying that this is the spiritual part and this over here is the unspiritual part.
Which is why feasting ties to body theology, which is a few episodes back.
Right.
But it's really, really important that we recognize all of life is integrated, body, mind, and spirit. And so there's nothing that we're about that's part of what it means to be fully human that isn't connected to our spiritual expressions.
When we don't have good understanding of this, though, what we create is Sunday morning Christians. So people that just see their Christianity, the only expression of that is I go and sit in a pew or a chair on Sunday morning and I sing a few songs. And that is where Christianity becomes like truthfully just really boring. If that's all it is, going to sing a few songs and listening to a talking head, and that's the extent of your idea of relationship with God.
You missed a big essence.
I'm bored for you.
Yeah, I'm bored. Okay, so how about this idea? Like, we're the only part of God's creation that is intended to feast. Like, that's a kind of interesting thing, right? Like, this is part of what it means to be human. And the gift of feasting is actually central to the Old Testament understanding of what it meant to be God's people.
Yeah, and our final biblical narrative foreshadows the great feast of the marriage supper of the Lamb. So it's really important because it's on both ends.
In a sense, we're bookended by the feasts as God's people today. So how important then is it to discover again the value of feasting as God's people and not just following cultural traditions, right? Yeah, so in this episode, I think we're going to consider some parameters around godly pleasure as well as challenge how we foster rhythms of feasting.
Yeah, and I think we want to facilitate deeper meaning in approaching any table that is Christ-centered.
Right.
And probably the idea of making every table Christ-centered.
Yeah.
That it is not, that when we pray before we eat, that's not like the obligatory pray that I don't get food poisoning. Or my husband who thinks it's really hilarious when he prays, and God, take all the calories away. That's not what that prayer is meant to do.
Right.
We pray as a tradition before food, not because God requires that of us, but because it is to focus
a reorientation.
On the blessings and the bounty that God gives us.
I used to be so cheeky when I was a teenager. My mom, I just was challenging everything. Like that isn't a total surprise.
It's not hard to imagine.
But I remember being 15. We lived in this tiny little mobile home, and my brothers didn't actually have a bedroom. They had to sleep on mattresses or the futon in the front room. And I remember my mom bringing in my laundry, and she put a pile on my bed. She had folded, how kind. And I remember slapping my hand over top of her hand on the top of the pile and saying, "Dear God, thank you for Mr. Maytag," or whoever it was that invented the washing machine. And thank you for the dryer. And thank you for my mother. Thank you for the people who invented the bounce sheets. And I just like went off like this really sort of almost sarcastic prayer, because I kept trying to make the point, or like I'd get in the car and I'd put my hand on the roof of the car. "Dear God, thank you for Henry Ford. Thank you for someone who invented the wheel." And I was ridiculous, okay? But I wanted to know, why do we only pray at the meal? And why does Dad say the exact same prayer every day? It's kind of boring. Right. So I was, in a sense, leaning away from anything that seemed ritual or hollow, but I didn't at that time understand the reorienting intention at the table. And I think I've come, like where you were saying, like that's not what it's meant to be for. It's meant to focus our hearts, to be thankful and aware of the presence of God. Do you know that habit of setting a spot for Elijah? Mm-hmm. Like that old practice where they would, particularly at a feast, I think, they would set a seat for Elijah, is kind of how you think of it. Or you put a coat hook on the wall and it's for Elijah. And it just kind of means for any person, any stranger that you could welcome.
Foreigner.
Yeah. And in the same way that people made room for Elijah, there's a couple of stories in the scriptures where people, like one couple made an upper room.
Right. Even in their lack, people made room
and
for...
the widow in Zarephath and Sidon made room for him and shared out of her poultry. Right. And of course, it led to her own abundance. But so that's where that habit comes from. And I think it's a good one for us to cultivate. It's kind of like the prayer at the table is to welcome the presence of God. But sometimes it's good to just even physically make a space for no one who's present to say, Jesus is welcome and he can send others to our table.
I don't have room at my table to do that currently. There's too many children.
Yes, you have a lot of, and you guys have, a round table. I like it. What's your favorite feast, Jess?
I'm going to say that my favorite feast, I am a bit of a Christmas.
Yeah.
I love Christmas. I know how many days there are till Christmas.
Yeah. You are, and you're wild about your decorating.
I know, and it's so antithetical to who I actually am. You didn't believe me because this is the first time we've lived in the same place.
I've never been at your house at Christmas time until last year. So I tried to tell
Joyce about that I am tacky during Christmas, and I embrace it. I have a whole closet full of Christmas things.
She has a almost life-size Santa Claus.
So creepy.
Don't write us about Santa.
No, Satan Claus.
We know he's not Jesus.
But he is cute.
Yeah.
And he is scary. And he's motion activated. So if any of us come down in the middle of the night during the Christmas season,
you get the life scared out of you.
Ho, ho. Yeah, it's amazing.
That's pretty awesome. My favorite feast is Thanksgiving.
Right.
Which is, I don't know when people are listening, but in real time, when we're recording this tomorrow, or today, I guess, is the start of the Thanksgiving weekend. In Canada, we celebrate Thanksgiving quite a bit earlier. That's mostly because our harvest has already happened because we've already had a blizzard.
Right.
Anyway, I love Thanksgiving because I think it's, to me, one of the holidays that hasn't been commercialized.
This is where you and I differ.
I know.
I like bright lights.
Well, and I've been starting to challenge myself a little bit about Christmas and Easter and trying to make them more meaningful and less just resisting the commercialization.
I'm trying to embrace the tackiness of the season.
Yeah, you go, girl. But I love Thanksgiving because I actually have had a habit for a very long time of writing a letter or a card and making some kind of a gift to someone or to some people to describe what I'm thankful for. Let's eat a lot of turkey and hang out with our friends. And
yeah, this year our family's starting a little bit of a new tradition. So we live in Calgary, and the University of Calgary started this program called Home Away from Home. A friend of ours who's a chaplain
it's a really great program
on the campus, Kelly Johnson, amazing man and an amazing presence, been there for decades. He's amazing.
He's the real deal.
But he realized that he was in line with somebody at Starbucks or something. He started talking to somebody, and it was a young man who was here doing his graduate work. And Kelly talked to him just about his life and what he was doing. And the young man turned to him and said, "Thank you so much for talking to me. You're the first Canadian who's ever talked to me, and I've been here for 4 years."
Right.
And Kelly thought to himself, there must be all kinds of international students that just would like people to embrace them. And so this year in Calgary, they had a couple hundred students say, "Yeah, I would love to have a Canadian friend." And so this year we're welcoming a few students from Turkmenistan, and they're coming to our Thanksgiving meal, to our feast.
Home away from home.
Yeah, making it a little bit different. And we've talked to our kids, and we've always invited people who are marginalized at some level, but we usually know them. And so this year is going to be a new tradition for us to make new friends from other countries and to share the bounty that God's given us.
This is awesome. And I think it ties to the episode we did ages ago on hospitality, which we sandwiched in between the social justice episodes. And it applies there for sure, because to make room for the other, we referenced Christine Pohl's book at that time. And I think it applies here because to make room also is tied to our feasting and our welcome of the other to our own tables. And we dialogued a bit about that. But I love what Marva Dawn says. If you've never read Marva Dawn, please go and read the lady. Or if you ever get a chance to hear her speak somewhere, I highly recommend it to you. But she wrote a book called Keeping the Sabbath Holy, WHOLLY. And the subtitle is Ceasing, Resting, Embracing, Feasting. And so again, this would tie to some of the things we talked about in terms of Sabbath-oriented living or rest. But here's what she says about feasting. She says, if we lived more simply most of the time, our feasts would be distinctive events. As it is, since most Americans, and she's an American, okay, so this is the reason she's framing it this way. She says, as it is, since most Americans have all kinds of special things to eat every day, for many, the only way to make Thanksgiving and Christmas feasts uncommon is by eating more. It would be good if we could restore the concept of feasting not as something to regret, brackets, don't we all have to lose a few pounds after Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's season, but as a delight.
Yeah, I think this quote is powerful and
confronting.
A little bit. Because it challenges things that we generally think are outside of the realm of discipleship and spirituality.
Right.
So how I eat and what I eat, I sort of put that into a category of none of your business.
Right. Totally. Right. And we want to exclude texts or passages that used to be historically really uber texts in the church, particularly the Catholic Church, the 7 deadly sins. Right. Gluttony makes that list. And we don't think of ourselves as gluttons, but let's be candid. We have an obesity issue in North America that doesn't exist in most parts of the world.
Right. My friend, he's a recording artist, and he is from Sudan. And he said to me, I try to tell my little Sudanese brothers and sisters, just kids that live in his village, that people are actually dying in North America from too much food. And he said, it is one way to make the kids laugh and laugh and laugh. They laugh and laugh and laugh, and they cannot believe that would be true.
Yeah. Right. So this again would tie to stuff we were talking about in terms of body theology and stewardship of our bodies as temple of the Holy Spirit. But we live in a culture where it's normative, not just to overeat, but to indulge every single day in something that will wow the senses.
Right. And some of it is, I think, if we are not obese, we think, oh, well, Well, look at me.
I'm not a glutton.
My thyroid is like overactive, so I don't have to. But I think gluttony is not just about the size of our body. Gluttony is about the intent of our heart.
Right.
And like you said, the overindulgence of our senses and the pushing away of simplicity and having to have things that are intricate and fancy.
So I actually came under some conviction about this a bunch of years ago, living in Vancouver. And I was busy. I had a busy life. I was also single. And it was very easy for me anywhere near Commercial Drive. Those of you that would know the city would know it's so international. And you can get like something really good and yummy in a plethora of cuisine genres, if you want to call it that, every single day. And so one day I could have Vietnamese, and the next day I could have Lebanese, and the next day I could eat something African, and the day after that I could have Thai. And it was just all the time, like sushi, like you can't even believe. Okay. And what I realized is, it was cheap as chips. Like I could eat all these amazing cultures for not that much money. So it wasn't bad stewardship in terms of like how I was spending my money, and you could argue you were employing people, whatever. But it was something about the excess of having to have something more every single day. Like, oh, I'm bored with that. Now I'm going to try this or whatever. And so when the Holy Spirit began to kind of nudge me about simplicity and humility, that's always my growth curve. It actually had something to do with not feasting every single day, but preserving those things for the Sabbath day as a type of feast. And we'll come to that in a minute. But then also the big feasts in the high seasons of the year, where we celebrate what it means to be the people of God more overtly. It sort of changed for me because then, my kids have grown up, because I had children after this period of conviction. They know it's totally normal to have soup as a supper very regularly. This isn't like, oh, mom has had an epic fail and now we're not having a real dinner. A nice hearty bowl of soup, maybe a piece of bread on the side, and that's dinner. Or to eat meatless on Mondays. Now we eat vegetarian more days than just Monday, but that was an exercise in frugality and simplicity, and it was tied to my creation care. Anyway, I digress. I'm a bit of a hippie, and Jess has already mocked me for that on this podcast in another episode. Yes. But you understand what I'm saying? Like that was something that got influenced. And Marva Dawn, when I read her, I was like, right. We have to get back to a type of simplicity in our regular life so that feasting can become more of what it was intended to be.
Yeah, I also think this is just an issue of kindness. I think that we show solidarity with the many, many people that don't have the option of eating like
solidarity is important.
Yeah, and I do think that this has something to do with the rhythms in the Old Testament, in the laws, where there was rhythm with these feasts.
Yep.
Part of it is the solidarity issue, that we don't create big gaps then between the haves and the have-nots. Because as a have, and anybody who lives in North America is a have, we have to make the choice to live in solidarity with people that live on the other side of the planet.
Yeah.
This idea that we are exceptional because we were born here is wrong thinking.
Yep.
And I think if you look at the Old Testament laws, you'll see that God put those in place so that everybody comes to the table together.
Yeah. So let's think for just a few minutes then about Old Testament feasts, because we referenced that at the beginning, just that there were, to be the people of God was to live a life oriented around the feasts. There are so many major festivals in the Old Testament in the nation of Israel. Do you want to unpack them a bit, Jess, in terms of calendar order, how they rolled through a year? Okay,
so here's the calendar order. You had the Passover feast, and that was, if you've ever watched Prince of Egypt, you'll know that was because they put they didn't die during the plagues. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, then it was the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Booths. And all of these feasts had a purpose, and we'll unpack that in a minute. But I think what is astonishing, if you think about this, that God actually forced people to feast.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Certain feasts,
your idea of God and how he mandated discipleship from the beginning of time
was tied to the table.
Was tied to the table and tied to eating and tied to pleasure and tied to joy.
Yeah, and togetherness.
I think sometimes when we read the Old Testament, we think, oh, well, they were just eating manna all the time and their food was horrible. And I don't like Mediterranean cuisines. Like, I think sometimes we actually don't think of the Bible characters as actually characters who actually had cravings and things that they loved and beauty. And we just think of them as in robes and dusty, walking around in dust.
Right. Or we tie it only to temple worship. Right. Yeah. And so we go, oh, well, we're past that. We live outside of the age of the law. So we don't think the feasts matter anymore.
Right. I realized once I married into this Italian family that in the Passover texts where God is telling the people how to eat, like he's telling them to eat every bit of it. And it reminded me as I read it again of my mother-in-law saying, you don't like my food? Eat it all. Eat it all. You don't like my food? Eat it all. Like this idea that we get to
delight in this.
Yeah, this was not like I think sometimes when we read these texts, we read it internally with angry God voice, like he's really mad. Eat it all. But I think he's actually calling us to enjoyment.
Right.
We get to eat it all.
Delight in this.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing is some of our feast, well, it depends on your biblical scholarship, but for me, I had a negative view tied to some of the feasting because I hear the prophets getting mad, like in Amos, like, you know, I think it's Amos or Micah. I get them confused sometimes, but hey, you want the new moon festival to be over so that you can get back on with robbing people, right? And imbalancing the scales. And so they had this obligatory space to the feasts where they would like, oh, can the new moon thing be done? Or can we move past this? Or Isaiah 58, like, is this what I've called you to? You know, only a day for, and that's the fasting, right? But the contrast with the fasting was the feasting. And sometimes, like, you remember Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and like they were way out of control with the feasting and they were being inappropriate and
they perverted the feast.
Totally. And it was for the self.
Hedonism. It became hedonism.
Totally.
At its worst.
So I had this idea like that the feasting was bad because all this bad stuff happened with the feasting and God had to like address it. Thank goodness we're past the age of feasting or the law and all the feasts that were tied to it. But I actually think it's really important that we realize, no, that's not actually what was in the text originally. Like the Feast of Weeks is actually also the Feast of Pentecost. So the weeks were 7 weeks after the Passover feast. And of course, Passover is Easter, right? Like it is and it isn't. We can digress a little bit about that. But Jesus became the Passover lamb. Okay. And so when Jesus died, even though it wasn't in April or March or whenever we celebrate our Easter celebration, when it happened in real time, it was on the Passover feast that all of that went down. And then the 7 weeks, which is a sign of completion, 7 sevens. And then you have the Jubilee, like the 50, right? All of this tied to the Old Testament. So what we understand is Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit was poured out, is actually a real Jewish feast still to this day. And God showed up at a feast. The Holy Spirit was poured out at a feast as the Feast of Weeks, which was it was one of the harvest feasts. Right. So it's the sign of the first fruits of the harvest in the church, right? Like, so why would God do that? Why would he tie his death and resurrection to a feast and his coming in power at Pentecost to a feast? That isn't to be, sort of glossed over like that was coincidence.
Coincidence, yeah.
That is intention. That's God saying the feast really, really matters. The Day of Atonement, of course, is Yom Kippur. Feast of Trumpets is Rosh Hashanah. And the Feast of Purim still happens, the celebration of when Esther saved her people, right? Like these are things that if you have any Jewish friends, you'll know, oh, they have these things. So do we. Mm-hmm. As New Testament followers of Jesus, we are tied to the Old Testament people of God. We're tied to these feasts and they should matter to us.
Right. And I think you can see, like I echo what you're saying, that when you read the prophets, you do see that there was overconsumption in the feasts and there was perversion of the feasts.
An exclusion of the poor.
Right. But I think what's interesting is that the prophets never called for an end to the feasts. Mm-hmm. They just called for a realignment.
Yeah.
So I think in this day, I think that prophetic voice still rings clear that there must be realignment to our practice of feasting or our lack of practice of feasting or our over-feasting or perversion of feasting.
Yeah. And even you look in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 11, when Paul's addressing the Corinthian church about the table of Jesus, of course, communion then was a feast, right? It was a meal. It was the love feast is how they described
it. Was not
it.
Plain wafer crackers or salty.
No, Ritz crackers and grape juice.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the Eucharist or communion, but I think it's important to remember that they were perverting the feast.
Right.
They were going ahead and giving privilege to rich people and eating before the poor people showed up and not making room for them, and so disregarding or sinning against the body of Christ, which Lord knows that's been misinterpreted 1,000 times. Go back and read it for yourself. There was exclusion being practiced. And so he really kind of spanks them and says, stop it, which isn't that unlike what some of the Old Testament prophets said about the maligning of some of the other feasts. And so I think it's really important, Jess, what you bring up is it wasn't a call to like stop it, right? Any more than we would stop coming to the table of Jesus today.
Right. Because I think we have overreaction in both areas.
Yeah,
so we become hedonistic or we become like
legalistic.
Yeah. And stark and like just no joy at all.
Yeah.
And I kind of think about this. I always think about this in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So I'm going to out myself. I'm a geek when it comes to Tolkien. And
go.
When I watched the movies, and I did love the movies. We were like geeks who went for like the premiere events at midnight.
Yeah.
This is before we had children, obviously. Mm-hmm. But one thing I noticed in the movies is that they didn't have the rhythm that the books did. So the books spent a lot of time talking about feasting and it wasn't all dark. I loved the movies, but I think they were quite dark and like
the emphasis, was on orcs.
Right. I wonder though if, and I just thought about that for a while, and I would often talk to my husband, Dave, that these movies mirror reality right now. And I think they mirror reality in the church sometimes, that we tend to emphasize the dark.
Right.
We tend to emphasize, but we forget that in the dark, there's still joy.
Right. There's
Rivendell. That God gave us these joyous feasts to practice love and joy and kindness and celebration
and delight.
Delight, yeah.
Yeah, and that the joy isn't just in the life to come, it's meant to be right now. And that's why we're bringing up feasting in this idea of what it means to flourish as the people of God. My favorite Old Testament feast is Purim, because in Esther 9:22 it says, observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. And I think if you want to understand like how to celebrate really well as the people of God, this is a good description Mordecai laid out. And it's been practiced in perpetuity for a really, really long time. This is where I think we get it a little bit wrong with Christmas, right? Like we give gifts of food to one another. Well, or mom cooks a giant feast and gives it to everyone at the table. But gifts to the poor, I think that has started to change. I mean, a few years ago, we bought some goats, or you can buy a sheep or whatever. You buy something, the amount of money you would spend on whatever for your kids, you might match that and buy an animal for, a family member in another part of the world to bring their family out of poverty. You can do that through groups like World Vision. I think Compassion has that kind of program. My third cousin started an organization in the States called heifer.org. I think they might have been one of the first ones, actually, to think about doing this, making gifts to the poor around our own feasts. And you can do that in your own city. I do kind of react against it a tiny bit because I think it's only Christmas, right? Then we think about, we should buy some mittens or we should contribute to something in the whatever soup kitchen.
But I would react against your reaction and say, for some people, that's a great start.
Right. And what I would say is that's where I try not to be too hard-hearted. I just love it if it got tied to more of our feasting, not just a once a year thing where we think about people who are underprivileged.
But a start is a start.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a good point. So I think, Esther, observe the days as days of feasting. It might be a day. It might be multiple days.
I love reading this story. And when you get to Esther 9, so it's the culmination of all this tense pressure. And then God says, go and have a feast. Yeah. And I think that's what he's calling us to. I mean, the reality is this. We live in a very pressure-filled world. If you work or live or you're still breathing, I'm going to say, and it's not prophetic to say that you're probably under a great deal of stress. All the studies point to the fact that we are under more duress than ever. I read an interesting article this week in the Globe and Mail a Toronto-based newspaper that was saying that there's such a high level of anxiety in people and that we've got to learn to deal with it. But I think part of the way that God throughout the Old Testament got people to deal with their high levels of anxiety, you got to figure, like, the Jews were all about to be exterminated. And then there's this great relief because they're not exterminated. But God, what does he tell them to go and do?
Have a party.
Have a party, like a wild party. And I'm not talking a hedonistic party, but
delighting in all the gifts of what it is to be human.
Right. And sometimes I wonder if we read these stories and we think, well, it was like a proper party. And by proper, I mean, like, do you remember when you were a teenager and invited to go to some weird party of your parents, or like, and it was like you had to wear pantyhose at it? That's how I would describe it. Like, you just felt uncomfortable the whole time. It's the worst thing ever. Mm-hmm. I try to read these feasts through this lens. Sometimes I think I read it through that lens, like a drudgery party. But if you undo the Hebrew in those places, no, he was calling them to like real joy, like that unbridled
dancing and food and just laughter. And
I wonder if part of our issue with anxiety, like overwhelming anxiety and depression in our culture, is that we don't, because we sort of semi-party, we semi-feast.
It's basically escapism.
Right. Well, we semi-feast. No, I think we semi-feast. I actually don't think we actually have these moments where we totally let down our hair and are joyful and actually let the burdens of the world sort of like fall off us, and we're just together having fun. Because think about it, like at Christmas, at Thanksgiving, at Easter, if you're a mom or a dad or whatever, you work really hard for these events and they're tension filled.
Yeah. Well, and there's a tremendous amount of loneliness. Obviously, like, there's a reason the Christmas season is also known in certain areas that people work in, particularly social work, as suicide season.
Right.
Because there's an incredible loneliness and displacement. That's why the home away from home program that you were talking about, it actually matters.
Right.
There's ways to welcome people in and have it be gift and not pain filled.
Right.
But I think even if you weren't, in a deep place of loneliness or alienation or have very bad traumas tied to feasts historically in your family narrative or whatever, you can still live with a tremendous amount of pressure to make it like the culture describes. And then you end up with disappointment and exhaustion and like that stress you were describing. And I think Jesus calls us to a different kind of feasting.
Right.
It's a different kind of simplicity. It's a different kind of welcome. Honestly, you could have a feast with a cup of coffee and a store-bought muffin. It's how you come at it.
Right.
And how you engage it. We have a little rhythm in our family because we try to have a Sabbath every week and 24-hour period of rest. And we talked about that on the rest episode. But my kids kind of know it as Friday night treat night. Uh-huh. And so instead of having cookies and candy and chips and, I don't know, fizzy things all week, they're allowed to have something as part of a feast on Friday night. And there is always a dance party. There's always furniture cleared in the front room and music put on. And if there's people over, there's a dance party. If there's no people over, the four of us are grooving, and they're showing us their best breakdancing moves. And I'm panicking because someone's going to break something other than just break the move. But at the end of the day, they have this understanding that we relax as a family, we delight as a family, we take joy as a family, we celebrate as part of our resting and letting go of the exhaustion. I think that's part of what God created us for. Mm-hmm. Jewish people get this.
100%.
Sabbath, Friday night Shabbat meals, it's a totally different thing than we understand. And we could learn from them. We could probably join in a time or two so that we go, oh, that felt really good.
Yeah.
And we get a different kind of posture. What else do you want to bring to this, Jess? I know I was going to tell a story. I forgot about this. Two things. So when we got married, we thought, hey, to be married, to have a wedding is a foreshadowing feast. Always. We don't always realize this, but it is a foreshadowing, I think, of the marriage supper of the Lamb. And I kind of think when you describe, I think we're going to eat in real time in some
good things,
future place of the inbreaking kingdom. But I don't actually think the Holy Spirit's going to brood over the table and food will magically appear. And then he's going to brood over the table and the dishes will be done. I just don't. I think he's put
I'm disagreeing
gifts.
with you.
You are wrong about this. He put gifts in people, right. Beautiful gifts. Those ones with we talked about creativity and the purpose of the vocational arts. I'm convinced that some of the best chefs are going to cook at the marriage supper of the Lamb, and we are going to have a party like none other. But we're also going to get to collaborate in the clearing up and the making new of things at the end. And so when we got married, because I am a bit of a Bible nerd and theological things really matter to me. So I wanted more than anything for the feast or the party at the wedding to be something that would foreshadow. So we invited our friends who could cook the best out of anyone we knew. So Ficus and Franck. And we asked them if they would cook for our wedding, and they did. And it was mind-blowing food. Like we had these, I don't know, Ficus came up with these meatball skewers. They were kind of Asian meatballs on sugarcane skewers. And so when you would bite into them, there's this explosion in your mouth. It was unbelievable. And we had curry. Callum and I love to travel, and we love international food. And so we had all this beautiful food at our wedding. And we had to have them make something just for Nanny Margaret, because she was from Wales and, lived in her village her whole life. She was a meat and potatoes lady, and she wouldn't have known what to do with the things that we were putting on the table. So we considered her as well. And anyway, and then our friends set the table, and they cleaned up the tables and did the dishes. And there was no partly it was because we just didn't have big bucks to hire catering, but partly it was also because this is an expression of who we were. So we wanted the feast to be tied to how we celebrate. And I'm not saying everybody should have a wedding like that, but what I am saying is when you have a celebration, let it be an expression of who you are, and let it be a foreshadowing of something that's coming. I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing is we have to find new ways and new expressions to feasts that are tied to God's provision for us, that are tied to his joy in our life, that are tied to who he's created us to be.
Can I tell one more story?
Yep.
Okay, so there was a bunch of years ago, Easter, it was coming up, and we were living in this apartment building. We were newlyweds, and we made friends with another couple who had moved in on our floor. Shout out to Sarah and Dylan if they're listening. I guess, I don't know if it was Dylan had talked to Callum, but anyways, Callum came and informed me that we were going to be having Easter dinner with them because they were going to be house sitting Sarah's parents' house out in Point Grey, which is kind of a fancier part of the city. And so it's a beautiful house. And so they thought, hey, well, we've got space. We should have a party and we'll do Easter dinner and invite a lot of people. And they invited us, which was super kind. But then when Callum told me, I was kind of truthfully a little bit disappointed because I was like, we're going to have Easter dinner with a whole host of people who are not necessarily people who would claim to follow Christ. So to me, it was kind of like, we're going to ruin our feast by just going and having a cultural dinner somewhere. This is really this is the highest point of the life of the church. I don't want to have it with people who don't claim to follow Christ. And he was like, you need to get over yourself. And we're going to have Easter dinner with our friends. And I wasn't against that, obviously. But I just thought, I don't know how to celebrate Jesus with people who don't celebrate Jesus. Anyways, we went. And it was really, really interesting and awesome in lots of beautiful ways. But there was these moments where I was like, okay, it's Vancouver. They had some friends who were artists. There's definitely a hippie vibe, among the crowd. And some people might have been using certain substances to achieve a different plane of enlightenment. And Callum had brought a bunch of drums. And so he was running a drumming circle, which is no surprise. But I ended up in the kitchen with my friend Olympia, Dylan's sister, and we were preparing food, and I had an apron on. I was just trying to get in and serve and help and delight in the food. And then we finally get to the table. I don't know, there's 18 or 20 of us. We're all sitting around and eating, and it was really good food. It was a beautifully laid table, and there's really interesting people there. And then this one guy, he has his mouth full, and he kind of goes, out of the blue. I can't totally say this on the podcast, but he basically said, you can use your imaginations. He's like, what the F are we celebrating anyways? And Dylan looked at me across the table and kind of raised his eyebrows, give me a little head motion. Do you want to answer that? And I kind of shrugged my shoulders oh, okay. And he said, I think Joyce might have an answer. And so he's kind of outing me a little bit there. And I said, well, we're celebrating actually the death and resurrection of Jesus. And then this guy goes, well, what the F does that have to do with Easter bunnies and eggs? And I was like, yeah, good question. And so then I explained about fertility cults and the abundant life that they were trying to celebrate with lots of sex and procreating, and symbols of abundant life would be eggs and bunny rabbits. Then the Christians co-opted this pagan feast as an announcement of the most abundant life. You can't get more abundant than being resurrected from the dead. And so Jesus is the ultimate announcement of abundant life. And so they co-opted this pagan fertility cult. Lots of Christians don't know this. And so made it the ultimate announcement is resurrection. And so this led to this tremendously interesting conversation. And I had perhaps, I think actually, my most profound Easter celebration of the resurrection with a bunch of people who just wondered what the feast was about anyways. And that was good for my judgments and my biases and all kinds of things, but also was really refreshing to remember, what is the feast for? Who is the feast for? How do we welcome others? How do we put ourselves in places where we wouldn't normally be at maybe that table or with certain people? And to not just let our feasting be insular, I guess is a way to describe it, that there's announcements being made.
Right. And I think how we feast is an announcement of the good news of the kingdom.
Right.
So I think to become a feasting people, to become people that are known for our feasts, should be good and true, should be true of us, and should be it is a bit of an announcement of the inbreaking kingdom.
Yeah.
That there is so much to celebrate, that there is so much to be joyful about. So get out there and
get your feast on.
Yeah, and let God really challenge you about how you feast and when you feast and who you feast with.
Awesome.
Eat and be merry.
See you next season.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Down to Earth. We hope you've enjoyed listening and feel inspired to grow in your relationship with God and to engage your life in ways that shape your culture and community.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment and leave a review on iTunes. Not only does it let us know how we're doing, but it helps other people find the show. Remember, if you have any comments, questions, or feedback, please leave them in the comments on this episode at downtoearthpodcast.com.